But let the righteous be joyful. Let them exalt before God. Let them be jubilant with joy. Sing to God. Sing praises to his name. Lift up a song to him who rides upon the clouds. His name is the Lord. Be exultant before him. Father of orphans and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation. God gives the desolate a home to live in. He leads out the prisoners to prosperity, but the rebellious live in a parched land.
Today is the conclusion of our sermon series, Game Changers. We've looked at the stories of the people who surround us, who we've known in St. Andrew Church. And we look at the lives of people like Rosa Parks and Mother Teresa and learn lessons about courage and compassion. And today we conclude our series with the story of William Wilberforce. And our focus is on justice and God's concern for justice in the world. William Wilberforce was born in 1759. He was the only child of a very prosperous English family of merchants. But his father passed away when he was only 9 years old. And around that same time period, his mother became deathly ill. And so he had to go and live with his aunt and uncle. Now this was during the period of the Enlightenment. And the social upper crust were mainly deists. A deist is a person who believes in the existence of God, but doesn't believe that a person can have a personal relationship with God or experience God. And a deist doesn't really believe that God interferes with the affairs of the world. And even though William Wilberforce's grandparents and parents were members of the Church of England, they were really deists. But his aunt and his uncle were the exception. They were also wealthy elitists in England, but they were deeply committed Christian people. In fact, according to deists, they were the worst kinds of Christians. They were Methodists. Another name they were given were enthusiasts, which is equivalent to the modern-day Bible thumper. And William lived with his aunt and uncle for 3 years, from ages 9 to 12. And while he was there, he was exposed to the Christian faith. He got to meet a lot of remarkable people like George Whitefield, who was a renowned Methodist preacher. He was one of the founders of Methodism. And he also got to know John Newton, who was a close friend of the family. John Newton had been a captain of a slave trade ship, and as an adult he was converted. He became a minister and a hymn writer, and he ultimately wrote the hymn, "Amazing Grace, How Sweet the Sound." But when William was about 12 years old, his mother had miraculously recovered, even though she was kind of sick the rest of her life. And she was horrified to learn of how her son was being indoctrinated. So his mother and his grandfather came and rescued him, and it became their goal to free him from all of the Christianity that he had been exposed to. And they were successful in doing that. By the time that William was about 16 years old, he no longer held any of the beliefs or any of the values that he did as a young person. And it was at the same time that he entered Cambridge University, where he kind of became a party animal. He enjoyed the life of a rich young person. But he was also a really smart man. He was intelligent, he was successful, he was charming, and he was a great orator. And all of these qualities helped land him a seat in Parliament just 2 weeks after his 20th birthday. He got to experience a lot of amazing things in his life. This immediately vaulted him to a place of prestige and popularity in the major social circles of London. He was a member of 5 exclusive gentlemen clubs, and he got to meet people like King Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and Benjamin Franklin. And so as he traveled around the world, he got to meet all kinds of people and have all kinds of amazing experiences. But when he was 25 years old, he kind of had a pivotal experience. He was planning on going on an extended vacation, and it was really to care for his mother. He was trying to take her to a warmer climate, and so they were planning on going to the French and Italian Rivieras. And that was a 1,200-mile journey as the crow flies. And their only mode of transportation was a horse-drawn carriage wagon. And so you can imagine this was a really long journey, and he wanted to have some kind of companionship, someone to keep him company. And so he essentially started holding interviews of people who could go with him. He wanted someone who was intelligent, someone who was funny, someone who was entertaining. And he found all of these qualities in a man by the name of Isaac Milner. Milner was a professor of physics at the University of Cambridge. And he actually held a seat that was once held by Isaac Newton and more recently Stephen Hawking. And so it's safe to say that at that time period, Isaac Milner was the smartest person on the face of the planet. And William Wilberforce was not disappointed by his company. He was smart, he was engaging, he was hilarious. They really enjoyed their time together. But Wilberforce was shocked when he learned that his new friend was a Christian. And not just any Christian, he was a Methodist. And during their conversations and their debates, Wilberforce was absolutely devastated because he came to the conclusion that his convictions, his beliefs, and his values were wrong. And it's kind of interesting because as a pastor, I've met people along the way who have had some kind of a change in their worldview or have come to faith, and as a result of that, their life is filled with hope and joy and peace, but it had the exact opposite effect for William Wilberforce. He was plunged into a deep depression because he couldn't figure out how his life as a Christian could be compatible with life as a politician. Now, we might find that a little bit funny, considering the fact that our world is in the midst of a lot of political turmoil and chaos right now. But it was even worse in the days of William Wilberforce. What we suspect might happen behind the scenes, corruption of political figures or political systems, those kind of things were happening in broad daylight. They were values, those were things that were being embraced. And so for William Wilberforce, it was going to be a real challenge for him to live out his Christian faith and remain a member of Parliament. But he continued to wrestle with this for about 2 years before he decided that he needed to have a conversation with someone who might be able to help him. And so he decided to contact the family friend, John Newton, the writer of Amazing Grace. He was embarrassed to go have this meeting, so he met with him at night when no one could see him. And they had this conversation, and as he was bearing his heart and his soul, he just couldn't reconcile how he could be a Christian and a political leader. And that's when John Newton shared with him that not only could he do it, but that he believed that God had raised him up for such a time as this. That God had chosen him for this specific time to do great things. And so Wilberforce began to look at his circumstances from a different perspective, and he saw his vocation as a member of Parliament. He saw it as a divine opportunity and a divine calling. Less than 2 years after this conversation with John Newton, William Wilberforce wrote in his journal that God had called him to do two things, or God had put two things before him to do. The first was to abolish the slave trade in England, and the second was the reformation of manners, which is an ancient, archaic way of saying the reformation of morality or society. There were all kinds of causes that he took up in his life, all kinds of problems. For instance, there was a problem of child labor during that time period. Children who were 5 and 6 years old were working 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And this is actually the same time period that Sunday school was invented. A man by the name of Stephen Langdon took the opportunity, since children, their only day off was on Sunday, he would pay them a penny to come to Sunday school, and it was during that time that he would teach them to read and to write. But the child labor was a real problem that William Wilberforce wanted to eradicate during his lifetime. Another issue that seemed to be a systemic problem was alcoholism. It had actually become an epidemic in their time period. Wilberforce recounts people coming to Parliament who were drunk, and he says that most people from that time period were alcoholics. The result of that was that people were engaging in all kinds of really bad activities, bad ideas. There was animal brutality and human brutality that was taking place as a way of entertainment for people who were intoxicated. And just as we see the issue of the opioid epidemic in our country and in our state being an economic motivator for bad behavior, in his world, prostitution was a major issue. In London, 25% of single women were prostitutes, and the average age was 16. And so as he began trying to take on all these massive issues, he realized that he wasn't just trying to pass legislation, or he realized that he wasn't going to be able to just put legislation on the floor, that he was actually battling against spiritual battles, spiritual issues. And the only way that he would be able to convince people to change their mind was to see humanity in a different light. Because after his conversion, after he became a Christian, the major thing that changed in William Wilberforce's life is the way that he saw a human being. He saw people as created in the image of God and of sacred worth. And he was convinced that the only way that he could convince everyone else to change human trafficking and slavery and issues of child labor was to help the general population look at everyone else as their neighbor, a person created in the image of God. And he did this through some really creative ways. He would throw big dinner parties on boats that had been used to traffic slaves across the ocean. And as people came all decked out, the social upper crust came in all of their fancy clothing, they would come and he would explain to them that what they smelled on the ship was the smell of death. That 600 slaves would be packed into a space that was 18 inches by 18 inches. And by the time they crossed to England, 400 of those slaves died. 2/3 of the people died on the journey over. And he continued to use really vivid images and opportunities to show what was happening in the slave trade. And he fought, and he fought. And 18 years later, in 1807, Parliament passed a bill abolishing the slave trade. The problem was that it continued to exist illegally, and the Royal British Navy had to continue to intercept ships that were bringing slaves over illegally. And so he continued to fight that most of his life. He also made it his goal after the slave trade was made illegal, he began to fight for the abolishment of slavery. And 3 days before he died, while he was on his deathbed, Parliament voted to abolish slavery in England. I am just so incredibly moved by his life and his story. I'm so inspired by him, and I think about, if I have the opportunity, if I have the privilege of being able to lie on my deathbed and to reflect on my life, I hope that I can say that I made it count like William Wilberforce did. I hope and pray that I will make my life count, because God has called each and every one of us to be game changers. God has called us to do what we can with what we've got. In our scripture reading, the psalmist says that the righteous people rejoice. They rejoice because God is the father to the orphan. God defends the widow. He builds a home for the desolate. And he leads the prisoner into prosperity. God is a God of justice. And God calls us as God's people into a life of justice, to stand up for what is right and what is good, to be a voice for those who have no voice. And as I sing this song, as I hear this song, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, I'll never hear it the same way again. Because honestly, I've kind of, for the last several years, I've struggled with the first line of that song, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I always thought that the word wretch was a little bit harsh. And as I hear the story behind it, I realize that it's an autobiography. It's a story of John Newton and his repenting of his life as a captain of a slave ship. As he shared with William Wilberforce that he lived with ghosts, as his conscience haunted him. And the only way that he could be free from that guilt and that shame was to claim amazing grace. But I think sometimes the problem that we have with that song is we often just think about what God has saved us from, and we forget about what God has saved us to. God saved John Newton from being the captain of slave trading ships. God saved William Wilberforce from a life of self-indulgence and licentiousness, but God also saved them to something. God saved them to be game changers, to be people who would live out God's justice and God's righteousness in the world. And that's what God's grace does in our life. It not only saves us from something, but it saves us to something. To be God's people in the world, to stand up where there is brokenness, to be a voice for those who are hurting, for those who are lonely, for those who are marginalized. Throughout this sermon series, there's been a lot of conversation, and I love talking to you as you come to me and ask me questions. And recently someone came to me and asked, Pastor, does God just call ministers, or does God call everyone? How does all of that work? God calls all of us. Every single one of us. God has placed a calling on your life and on mine to make a difference, to make our lives count, to stand with God as we stand with the orphan, the widow, the desolate, and those who are bound. So may we embrace justice and courage and compassion, so that through the power of God's love and the power of God's Spirit, we might change the world. Amen.